Sure.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, this is mainly for the online, so just making sure you're talking to it for help for them.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for that, Tom. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff and some new analysis in there as well, so it's good to get that out there. I suppose I'll challenge a little bit some of the things that you've suggested, that some of these arguments that you've heard from NGOs like Oxfam and some developing countries in the negotiations are purely moral and equity arguments. I mean, I think clearly there's an important basis of many of those arguments in the effectiveness debate, and that's what I'll try and argue in some ways. So I was going to look at, there were a number of questions that had been set, I think, as part of this debate, and I was going to look in particular at the question about how to identify adaptation priorities, and then how adaptation finance should be delivered, with perhaps just a word at the end for how to measure progress and value for money, popular phrase these days in DFID, when it comes to adaptation finance. And I think on all of those questions, Oxfam, I hope, puts vulnerable people at the heart of its answers. So we think that adaptation priorities ultimately should be determined according to nationally owned government-led strategies, which have the full participation of marginalised and affected communities. And so one of the principles that Tom was talking about, that of national ownership, for us is really a critical one in assessing the effectiveness of adaptation spending. So then how to provide the finance? Well, we think it should be provided through a much more harmonised, streamlined international system, consolidated as far as possible, and the establishment of the Green Climate Fund will be gives us an important opportunity to further consolidate funding to rationalise the international system. That funding should be provided in support of the types of national adaptation strategies I was talking about. We think to a national level entity, a lead agency identified by the government to take receipt of that financing, and there's, as Tom was saying, important lessons to be drawn from the experiences of the Adaptation Fund, the Kyoto Protocol Adaptation Fund, with its experiments with direct access. And wherever possible, we think that finance should be provided as budget support. And then on the value for money, I'll just mention a few problems with that, but clearly for us it will be important that it's the affected communities, those in receipt of the financing ultimately, that should have a role in determining the relative success and indicators used for assessing the impacts of climate spending, adaptation spending in particular. So I'll just drill down a little bit into some of those areas, and just to say a bit of a plug from our side, some of this is based on some forthcoming research from Oxfam, which is going to be published at the Bonn Intersessional, actually at an event which I think we're now co-hosting with ODI, so more Oxfam ODI events in the pipeline. And that new research is looking at various examples, emerging examples of national level governance of adaptation finance, and looking at what the strengths and weaknesses are. And through that research, we've really seen sort of three sets of problems with the current system, and some of these Tom has touched on. We see that adaptation finance is in far too many instances being channeled around governments, not in support of government strategies, through a range of often uncoordinated, unharmonised channels, and often without very much investment in building the national capacity of governments. But at the national level, equally we recognise that there is still a lack of clear leadership within governments in identifying the types of adaptation strategies which are needed, and often that comes down to a lack of capacity. But perhaps most importantly, it's pretty clear that the meaningful participation of affected communities, the most marginalised, the most vulnerable people in developing countries, that is yet to be realised in most developing countries that are in receipt of adaptation finance. So lots of work to be done there. So ensuring that sort of level of national ownership often poses providers of adaptation finance with something of a dilemma, and we could call that a capacity ownership trade-off. What comes first? Should we be ensuring government leadership or having a capable government? And for us, it's really critical then that all of our efforts in spending adaptation finance should ultimately be driven towards building the capacity of the sorts of effective governments that are able to implement the types of legitimate and effective strategies that we're talking about. And there's really some, the picture here is really rather mixed, and actually in many instances it seems that the provision of adaptation finance is bypassing those governments. In Cambodia you have a good example of this, where really nearly all adaptation finance is bypassing government almost entirely and being provided through international NGOs or local NGOs. And perhaps there's good reasons, historic reasons for that, very weak government institutions, weak capacity, but the act of continually bypassing is not helping necessarily to build the capacity of that government to develop and take ownership of its adaptation future. In Ethiopia, for example, we see that the JEF and a number of donors have stepped in to support adaptation projects, but none of those are ones which are listed in the NAPA, as Tom was suggesting. So often these are not picking up on even the existing national level strategies that are there. Or in Nepal, looked promising at one point when you had 14 development partners signing a compact with the Ministry of Environment in Nepal, suggesting that they want to more closely align their efforts. But actually, in reality, we see that most of the projects which they have since financed have been the types of bilateral and often one-off projects that Tom was talking about, not delivered outside, therefore, of the central government budget and structures, which is not exactly building the sort of capacity that we think is needed. So we think, therefore, that it's important to build that capacity. We should be streamlining the international channels that we have. Often, as we know, that is adding ever more transaction costs to national governments to have to go around shopping around a range of different funds, all with their own eligibility criteria, their own reporting requirements, and so on. So we should be streamlining those. And the GCF, as I suggested, the Green Climate Fund, does offer us an opportunity to rationalise that system. And if we had that type of arrangement in place, with ultimately the finance should be provided in the form of budget support to allow the government to set its own priorities. But just the other side of the coin, of course, is that does require governments to take ownership and to lead in this process. And what does that really look like? Well, on the basis of the work that we've done, we think that governments should be looking to identify a lead agency. Could be a department, could be an entity which is established. But that lead agency should then have responsibility for overseeing the development of the adaptation strategy, and then can be the main channel in receipt of the financing. Often that's the Environment Ministry by default, and it will depend on different country examples as to whether or not the Environment Ministry is the most appropriate channel. As we know, often Environment Ministries have relatively weak positions within their governments, so that could mean but that could either mean that we need to build their capacity or look for other more appropriate channels. But it's important that we have that leadership which allows strong coordination across the government, because we know that adaptation is about multi-sectoral challenges, so clearly we need the whole government brought into the process, a coherence with existing development planning, and then to be responsible for reaching out to and engaging meaningfully affected communities, the most marginalised amongst them. And I'll just spend a moment just talking about that, because that for us is really one of the critical factors here. Are we getting the participation of those communities? And in many instances that's not happening at the moment. Couple of examples. Cambodia again. When Cambodia was producing its NAPA, the only opportunity for civil society to come in was very much at the last minute. It was when the thing was already done, basically a question of coming in and having civil society rubber stamp an otherwise finished document. In Tajikistan, we had a very similar experience with the NAPA, only invited to come in at the very last minute and with very limited access to the documentation which was needed in the process of considering the NAPA and the process which had gone into its development. So those would be some of the weaker examples, but there are more promising examples out there as well. In Nepal, it is true that the NAPA processes included much wider consultations with vulnerable communities, and there's a lot to build on there. Or in Bangladesh, where of course we have a very strong civil society, very actively engaged in these debates, and managed to secure 2 out of the 17 membership seats on the board of the Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund. So there's examples in both ways, but clearly this is one of the critical areas that we need to build on. That will require, we think, providers of adaptation finance to make some finance available to civil society to build that capacity, but ultimately this needs to be with a view to their engagement with their own governments and holding their own governments to account for the management of the climate finance they receive. And I'll just say a final word on value for money and assessing value for money. I think that's a particularly challenging context in which adaptation finance being a particularly challenging context to assess value for money, not least because of the context of uncertainty in which we're dealing with climate change and adaptation to climate change, which means that we need to have the flexibility, and local communities need that flexibility, essentially to trial and error, to make mistakes, to try new things out. And also because of the timelines involved in being able to establish changes in baselines to resilience and vulnerability. But ultimately, we would say that in assessing, in drawing up those types of indicators, establishing those baselines, we do need to see the involvement of the vulnerable communities that are most affected and most in need of that finance. So that's, I'll leave it there. I agree with Tom that clearly climate finance is an aid, but there are lots of lessons that we can draw from the aid effectiveness debate. So many of these lessons and recommendations in many ways are not new, but what we do have, I think, is a new opportunity to get it right this time, starting almost from scratch with climate finance. So that's something that we're very keen to support. Thanks.